Lord Russell, when you began to write on philosophy, what particular things were you concerned to either affirm or combat?
I was mainly concerned to discover whether there is any knowledge that can be considered fairly certain. And I thought if there was such knowledge anywhere, it would be in mathematics. So I investigated the principles of mathematics to see what reason there was to doubt mathematics or what reason there was to affirm it. That's what started me off.
Well, how was your philosophical outlook when you'd completed your investigation of mathematics shaped by the concepts that you drew from mathematical operations?
Well, it's difficult to answer that question. I suppose I got a habit of thinking in a certain way that suited mathematical problems. And no doubt that did influence my thinking, but not consciously, and a critic would know that better than I should, because it would be unconscious.
The beginning of the 20th century, which is when your articles began to appear, was a time of great movements for reform on the one hand, and then a reaffirmation of things as they were on the other hand. Would you place yourself in either one of these two groups, the reformers or the reaffirmers?
No, certainly not. I mean, I want to keep what I think good and to reform what I think bad. And always, all through my life, there have been things I thought good and things I thought bad. So I could never put myself in either of those two camps.
You and Alfred North Whitehead agreed on certain logical questions and their formulation. How do you rate him as a philosopher?
Well, I never liked Whitehead's philosophy. While we collaborated, he wasn't working at philosophy. In fact, in England it wasn't known that he was a philosopher. It was only Harvard that discovered that he was a philosopher. In England, while we worked together, which was before he went to America, he and I only talked about mathematical logic, and when we did talk about anything else, I saw that there was a great gulf, but we didn't write about it, so it didn't matter.
At the turn of the 20th century, Thomas Hill Green and Josiah Royce were writing, the sort of neoliberals. What was your view of them?
Well, T.H. Green, I couldn't do with T.H. Green because he was a German idealist. He was, I suppose, most nearly a disciple of Fichte, but also, of course, of Kant and Hegel. And all that whole philosophy seemed to me just nonsense. I had believed in it. I believed in it, well, until I was about 26. And then I came to think it was just nonsense, and that applies emphatically to T.H. Green. Royce is rather a different proposition. Royce was mildly Hegelian, but he had a great deal about him that wasn't Hegelian, and he took up various ideas from the principles of mathematics rather fruitfully.
What did you think of the Fabians, Sidney and Beatrice Webb and...
Oh, I was very closely connected with them. I knew the Webbs very well, and I believed in the Fabians on the whole, though I always had a feeling which afterwards became dominant, that they were much too governmental. They had a belief in administration and efficiency and anti-democracy, and all that I didn't like.
Visited the Soviet Union in 1920,
yes,
I believe. What did you think of it then?
Well, I thought very ill of it indeed. I saw that it was authoritarian and cruel and ruthless and establishing an immense governmental power which was completely destroying all mental freedom, and I didn't like it at all. You see, I'd been a socialist, and I still am, but I think that if socialism is to be a good system, you have to have very careful safeguards of individual liberty, very careful, and none of these did they want. They didn't like individual liberty.
Have your views on Soviet society changed since 1920?
No.
Do you think that the structure of Soviet society has changed since 1920, or at least since the 20th
yes.
Party
Well, it
Congress?
hardly had a structure in 1920. The country was just in chaos. I mean, they just finished the Civil War, and they were desperately poor. The diet was only just enough to keep you alive. It was miserable, and altogether the country was in a dreadful state, and I think it was an immense achievement on the part of the Bolsheviks to pull it out of that. Immense, and I do respect them for that very much. I don't know whether it could have been done in a less authoritarian way, perhaps not. But you can't say society had a structure at that time, no.
Your views on the military policies suitable for dealing with the Soviet Union as a world power have changed, I think. Why was that?
Well, they've not changed, of course, as much as in the popular myth. There's a popular myth which has been very much exaggerated. But there was a time when America alone had nuclear power. And in fact, under the Baruch Plan, America was prepared to internationalize this nuclear power, which would have solved all our troubles and prevented any of the trouble we're in now. And so I thought this was a very admirable scheme, and I wanted Russia to accept it, but Russia wouldn't. Now, I did at one time think that perhaps they could be brought to accept it by means of threats. This was a view I only expressed in private letters, which were published without my consent. I never held it very firmly, you see, at all. And then when the Russians got nuclear weapons, that was finished. It was too late for that. So that was what made me abandon that point of view.
When you did abandon that point of view, was your letter to Einstein the first expression or public expression of having abandoned it?
Not letter to Einstein. The first public expression, I think, was the broadcast I made at Christmas 1954 called Man's Peril, which has been reprinted in volumes since. And I wrote to Einstein after that, and that was based, you see, on what you could do when you had a balance of nuclear power on both sides, which was a situation that hadn't existed in the earlier years.
Why did you choose to make a letter to Albert Einstein the opening salvo?
I didn't. This is an invention of yours. There wasn't any particular... The only thing was that Einstein and I had been in correspondence. I knew him pretty well, and I knew that his views were exactly the same as mine. And when I wanted to get, as I did, a number of eminent scientists to join in a declaration, it was natural to enlist Einstein, because he was the most eminent of them all, and I knew that his views were the same as mine.
Do you feel that scientists, either mathematicians or philosophers or atomic scientists, have a special responsibility for keeping the peace?
Well, yes, they had, because they'd invented the means of making war disastrous. The world had survived a great many wars through many thousands of years, and the scientists discovered a way of making that impossible, so that if there is a war, we don't survive. So they had that special responsibility. I don't say they had any special blame, that's another point, but they did have a special responsibility.
If as you say, they didn't have a special blame, who then do you put the blame upon?
Oh, on the politicians, on some scientists. Some scientists certainly deserve a very large share of the blame. They are the ones who are in government employ.
Has the pugwash movement, which grew after your correspondence with Einstein, justified the hopes and expectations that you had about it?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the conferences, all of which have had people both from East and West and also neutrals, the conferences have been very successful indeed in drawing up agreed statements of policy, of what scientific people thought ought to be policy on this or that. That's been very successful. But where there's not been success is in getting the press and the public to notice this. If the scientists had been in power, they'd have solved all our problems on the lines of pugwash declarations. But newspapers entirely ignored them, politicians entirely ignored them, and so they were not as useful as one might have hoped, because it's a principle of government that anybody who knows about anything is disqualified from speaking on it.
I'd like now to turn to this question of nuclear weapons specifically. Do you think that it was wrong for Einstein to have written his letter to President Roosevelt urging the president to build the atomic bomb?
Well, there you have to consider that it was in the middle of the war against the Nazis. Now that we know all that we do know, one can say it's a pity he did it. But I don't think anybody could have known it was, because I do think the defeat of the Nazis was absolutely vital. I mean, they were just people who had to be defeated. And naturally enough, everybody in Britain and America thought that the Germans must be getting on quite as well in the way of making atomic weapons as we were. The German physicists were very good, and Germany had always been very good in science, so that one naturally supposed, since we knew that we were beginning to be able to make an atom bomb, we thought, of course, the Germans must also be. And if the Germans had got one first, they would have won the war. And if they'd got one at the same time, they would have destroyed the world. So that it was, from what we knew, I think Einstein was right. But after the war, it turned out that the Germans had got nowhere towards making an atomic weapon. But that was an astonishment.
Was it right, having made the bomb, to have dropped it then on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Oh no, that was a dastardly and most beastly piece of wanton cruelty. The Japs were beaten. They were going to surrender quite soon. And there was no point whatever in dropping the first bomb, and when you dropped the first, there was still less point in dropping the second. They were wanton acts of cruelty. The Americans had made this wonderful weapon, they wanted to show it off. And if it killed some hundreds of thousands of people, well, that was a detail.
Faced then with an American bomb at the close of the war, and America was the only country in the world that had one apparently, what do you think the Soviet Union ought to have done? Accepted the Baruch plan?
It's very difficult to say what they ought to have done. Very difficult indeed. I mean, it was obviously human nature to say, well, we must have this weapon too. And it would be very difficult for a great power to say anything else. But of course it was the ideally wrong decision from the point of view of human welfare.
Yes. So you think that they should have accepted the Baruch plan and not tried to go ahead?
Yes, that's what they ought to have done, yes.
Today, in the contemporary Cold War, do you assign a greater share of the blame in this Cold War to either of the two power blocks?
I don't, and I'm very careful not to. I mean, I think both are profoundly to blame, and I will not try to make a balance as to which has the most blame. And I try very carefully, in all I write, to hold the balance even between East and West, and not show favour to one rather than the other.
Do you think that there's an alternative to the Cold War and to the balance of nuclear power?
Oh, of course there is, yes, quite easy. I mean, Khrushchev's proposal of universal and general disarmament would get round the problem. I mean, I don't know whether his proposal is sincere or not. I haven't the power to read his heart, so I can't tell. But taking his proposal on its face value, if that were accepted, it would go a very long way to solving our problem. It wouldn't be a complete solution. You can't get a complete solution without world government.
Well, that then leads to the next question. What do you think of the various proposals for collective security? Do you think it's possible to have collective security?
You can't have collective security while you have national armaments, because in a time of stress, every nation will forget all about its obligations and just go ahead and look after itself.
Then you think that the prerequisite to great power cooperation and collective security is disarmament?
Disarmament, first of all, yes. That, as I say, is not a complete solution, but until it is done, I don't think you can get a solution, because here we are, everybody living in fear. At any moment, one's whole population can be wiped out, and that gets people into such a state of fear, of tension and suspicion, that you can't do anything while that is going on. You've got to get rid of the power of instant destruction.
Why has the Committee of 100 chosen direct and non-violent action as a means of persuading the governments of the world to disarm?
Well, it's only one means. You mustn't think that they think it's the only means. There are a great many things. My chief reason for accepting it was that it was the only way to get publicity. You see, the newspapers and the television people and all the rest are against us, and we couldn't get any publicity, and we would have enormous meetings, very enthusiastic, and not one syllable in the papers about it. And also, if one tried to point out the danger that was involved in nuclear weapons, or the fallacy of civil defense, or any of those things that ought to be got known, you couldn't get any major organ of publicity to let it be known. But when we started doing slightly sensational things, then we got into the papers. And short of getting into the papers, you can't get the world awake to what's happening.
Does the selection of a non-violent method of action involve also the acceptance of a philosophy of non-violence, some kind of philosophical anarchism or pacifism?
No, nothing of the sort. At least for my part, I think there always have been movements of civil disobedience in all important matters, and some very unimportant matters. There was an act passed in 1902, an Education Act, which was objected to by the nonconformists because it seemed to them to give an undue advantage to the Anglicans. And all these pious nonconformists all practiced civil disobedience about it, and nobody said they were anarchists. The point is, of course, that any breach of the law on conscientious grounds is only justifiable on certain terms. In the first place, it must be a thing which the person doing it profoundly believes to be very important. In the second place, it must be a thing which he so much believes in that he's prepared to accept punishment. And that generally will eliminate what you might call frivolous resistors. But I don't accept any philosophy of anarchy, not for a moment. And nor do I think that civil disobedience is a principle at all. It's a tactic which in certain circumstances is useful, and that's all.
What's your attitude today toward Marxism as a philosophical system and as interpreted by the Soviet Union?
Well, I've written a number of critiques of Marx. The first I wrote was in 1896, and then I wrote a much fuller one in a book called Freedom and Organization, and also again in my book on the theory and practice of Bolshevism, the book that I wrote in 1920. And you will find much the same things in these different critiques of Marx. I have always profoundly disagreed with him. Not that I disagree with socialism, but I disagree with his philosophy especially, which derives from Hegel, and I think Hegel was nothing but nonsense from beginning to end. And from Hegel he derives the idea that these developments are inevitable, and they're not inevitable, not in the least. You can't say anything that happens in human history is inevitable. Then again, he's too terrestrial. I think if you want to get a sound philosophy, you must have astronomy well into your head and realize that this planet is a very unimportant and trivial part of the universe, and what happens on it from a cosmic point of view isn't very important. And he never thought of that. He never thought of anything but this earth. Then again, he thought too much of politics. He didn't think of the importance of all the rest of the things people do that are not politics. Art and literature and love and all the rest of it. All those he didn't care about at all. And then besides, what I think the most fundamental objection I had to Marx was that his whole outlook was based on hatred. And I don't think you can get a good philosophy based on hatred.
That's Marx's theory. Do you think that the Soviets have changed or altered any of the things that you had at the praise or criticized?
Oh, yes. I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't accept the Sermon on the Mount, and you can't expect an established state to accept the philosophy of a revolutionary, except verbally. They're bound to make all kinds of compromises as soon as they get power.
I'd like to insert a question here about something that was in the newspaper today. Cuba. President Kennedy made a speech last night, and today the Warsaw Pact powers are being mobilized. What now should people who are concerned about Cuba do, leaving aside for the moment the statesman?
What people should do is to emphasize that the Cubans have a right to whatever regime they prefer, that for the United States to say, you shall have the regime we like, not the regime you like, is exactly the thing that the Americans criticized Russia for in Hungary and in Eastern Germany, where the Russians came in and said, you shall have the sort of regime we like. And that's an intolerable wrong. And not only is it an intolerable wrong in itself, but it immensely increases the danger of nuclear war, which is the ultimate disaster. And so one should protest as hard as one possibly can against American intervention in Cuba. But, of course, there's a second point to that. If the Warsaw powers try by force to prevent American intervention in Cuba, they bring on a nuclear war, and that is a disaster. So that although American action in Cuba is abominable, warlike resistance to it is likely to be still worse.
That's advice for people as well as statesmen. Then, you think statesmen ought to follow that advice as well as just ordinary people who are concerned about it?
Would you say that again? The clock was striking and I couldn't hear you.
Do you think that President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev ought to follow that advice as well as just ordinary people who are concerned about Cuba?
Yes, President Kennedy, you see, his action is, I can't say how wicked I think it. He, I believe, knows perfectly well that a nuclear war is the thing above all others to be avoided. But he forgets that, and he's thinking at the moment that it's more important the Democrats should defeat the Republicans than it is that the human race should exist. And that is contemptible.
A moment ago, before we began the recorded interview, we were talking about the peculiar lack of protest in the United States against what action is proposed for Cuba. Why do you think that is?
Well, the United States has had a certain number of wars and has always won them. And the general public in America thinks that it's a law of nature that America wins wars. And when you tell them that a nuclear war can't be won, they just don't believe you. It goes against their instincts. I think the English thought the same thing until 1940. And in 1940 they suddenly realized that they might be defeated, which is an idea that never occurred to them before.
So you think that the English are a great deal less warlike today than the Americans?
Yes, because they've been so very near defeat. They would have been defeated in 1940 if Hitler had had any sense.
If we followed out your views that you've been expressing to us to their logical conclusions, what sort of a world order would you hope to see?
What I should hope to see is a world government which should of course be federal, and I think the units in the federation should not be always single states, but often federations of states, because you have the problem, if you have single states, that the small states have an undue weight, and that the Americans had to face it in their constitution, and they did it by having two houses, but that won't quite do in this case. So I think there should be a number of confederations, and they should be the units of the World Federation. The World Federation should have the only important armed forces. The single states should only have just enough for police purposes, not enough to make any serious war. And if the World Federation had all the important engines of war, war would become impossible. I don't think anything else will prevent war, and I do think that in the nuclear age, if there is war, the human race is wiped out.
When you speak of federations, would you include the common market as a desirable kind of federation, should it develop into something political?
It might be. I don't, as a matter of fact, favor it at all as things are, but something of the sort might be desirable. in a different political environment. But I don't like it at present because it means that England has to knuckle under completely to de Gaulle and Adenauer, whom I dislike.
When you mentioned the kind of world order that you hope to see, within the next 20 or 30 years, what kind of world order do you think we can expect to see?
Expect?
Yes.
I expect to see nothing but corpses. It's quite simple. I think the human race won't outlast this century.
Do you have anything else to add, Lord Russell, before we close?
Well, I should like to say over that I don't hold this view dogmatically. I'm in the habit of saying that the chances are 6-4 that the human race will come to an end during this century. But I don't regard it as by any means a certainty. I think it's likely. The thing I should like to say in conclusion is that if you wish mankind to survive, you've got to give up certain kinds of self-assertion. At present, in every country, self-assertion is thought glorious. I mean, national self-assertion. And if people can't be cured of that, they can't survive in the nuclear age. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and I don't feel any confidence that it will be done. But if it isn't done, we're finished.
Thank you very much, Lord Russell.